All right, welcome back to your new read aloud, which is Who Was Harriet Tubman? We are reading about her this week because we are learning about slavery. We're learning about the Civil War and the end of slavery, which we are all excited to hear about. But she was someone that was very important in the Underground Railroad. Who can give me a brief idea of what is the Underground Railroad? Madeline?
It's like this place where the slaves used to go to escape.
Yeah, we learned about this a long time ago during civil rights. We talked a bit about it. Today we started talking a bit about it. But she would help people journey from the South, where the slavery situation, the Confederacy, everything was still legal. She would journey them up to the North. Now, what did that mean? They'd hop on a train. What did they do? Because when I always heard railroad as a kid, I would think train. Why is it not that? Emma?
Because they would have to walk.
Yes, it was all in secret, right? So they had to be very secretive. Harriet Tubman is a cool woman. Here is the back of the book. Harriet Tubman was a former slave who risked her life to help other slaves escape to freedom. She was a nurse who saved soldiers' lives during the Civil War, and she was a Civil War spy for the Union Army. So we're going to learn all about her. Madeline?
How did she die? Did somebody shoot her?
Well, let's read the book. We're going to start with her birth, and we'll end with her death, so I'm not going to spoil it. All right. Who was Harriet Tubman? No one knows the exact year in which Harriet Tubman was born. It may have been 1820 or 1821. Almost everyone thought the birth of a slave baby wasn't worth remembering. Born a slave, Harriet Tubman grew into a brave and daring young woman. She was brave enough to escape from slavery. She was daring enough to help others escape too. Because she led so many to freedom, she was called Moses. Like Moses in the Bible, Harriet Tubman believed that her people would be free. And she risked her life many times to help them become free. Even after she had escaped safely from the South, she went back to take other slaves north to freedom. Here is her story. Chapter 1, Life in Maryland. Sometime around 1820 in Maryland, a slave named Harriet Ross had a baby girl. Neither Harriet, who was called Old Rit, nor her husband, Ben, could read or write, so they couldn't record the year of their baby's birth. No one else thought it was worth doing. All right, why do you think Harriet's parents couldn't read or write? Abby?
Because they didn't allow slaves do that stuff.
Right, slaves weren't allowed to learn. In fact, if you were caught trying to teach a slave how to read or write, or a slave was caught learning to read or write, you could be in lots and lots of trouble. So most slaves didn't know how to even write their names. Emma?
How come they weren't allowed to learn?
Well, the theory was if you learned too much, you'd be smart enough to try to get yourself to escape or to make a better life for yourself, which is true. The more they would have learned, they could have learned how to escape faster. But basically, it was just another way to oppress slaves. That means keep them down. So it wasn't fair, it wasn't right. They were very capable of learning. They just were not allowed. Do you think some people still snuck and learned and read and wrote? Definitely. And there were some people in the South who would sneakily teach slaves to read and write. But it was not allowed. You're not supposed to do that. Hayden.
How'd they find the Underground Railroad?
Well, we're going to keep learning about that. But it was a system of people that would kind of pass along ideas. So you might start at a station. Let's not get too far into that. We need to read the book before we go over that. Noah?
I read a book where his uncle was caught learning and got the whip.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Emma?
Well, they weren't doing a very good job because they still escaped.
Mm-hmm. I mean, people are going to try to get freedom, right? They'll do anything they can. So that's why they don't know what year she was born. They couldn't write it down, and they don't know. But Old Rit, which is her mom, that's her nickname, loved her tiny child and wanted to protect her. She hoped her little girl, whose nickname was Minty, would learn to sew, cook, or weave. Then she could be a house slave and avoid the back-breaking work picking crops like tobacco, corn, or wheat in the fields. So it was considered lucky to not be working in the fields. Field work is hot. It was really hard. You didn't get breaks. You worked sun up till sundown. You didn't get a lot of food. It was hard work. So a lot was to work in the house. So whatever you were doing in the house was considered better work than working in the fields. Zoe?
What's tobacco?
Tobacco is what you would make to make cigarettes. A long time ago, people in the South made lots of tobacco. Yes.
If they can't learn, then how do they know to do their job?
They were told. People told them how to do their job. All right. Next page. Old Rit and Ben had been born slaves. They had many children, all of whom were slaves too. Black people had been slaves in the United States for a long time. Ever since 1619, when blacks from Africa were kidnapped and brought on slave ships. They were brought to Virginia, and slavery had been part of American life. By the early 1800s, most of the northern states had stopped slavery, but the southern states had not. Slaves like Ben and Old Rit worked very hard, yet they were not paid for their work. Instead, Ben and Old Rit lived on land owned by their master, a man named Mr. Brodas. This land and the many buildings on it was called a plantation. And that's a big word for a big farm run by slaves. Angie?
Is there still slavery going on?
Not in the United States. In other parts of the world, yes, slavery still does go on. Mr. Brodus's plantation house was large and grand, like so many of those in the South. Ben and Old Rit could see the Brodus's big house every day, but they didn't live there. They lived in a log cabin, like the other slaves on the plantation. Slaves' cabins were very small. They had no windows. The floors were made of dirt. Piles of worn-out blankets were the only beds. Still, for little Minty, this was home and she loved it. As soon as she could walk, Minty joined her brothers and sisters and other slave children who were watched by an older slave. The littlest children ran and played naked. The older ones wore a coarse linen garment. All right, now why do you think clothes was hard to come by? Cadence.
Because they were poor.
Yeah, you only had what you were given. So if your master, the person who owned you, didn't give you clothing, you didn't have any. So it wasn't like they chose this life. This was what they were forced to do. So older children wore a coarse linen garment. Coarse means not soft. So it felt scratchy. It wasn't comfortable. So once you did get clothing, it wasn't nice to wear. None of them wore shoes. Still, though, they had fun. Summers were warm and bright. They swam and fished in the many streams and creeks. Even though she was a slave, Minty was happy. She loved her parents. Ben, her father, told her stories about the woods. He could name the birds. He knew which berries were sweet and tasty. All right, now this is a little side note called Bought and Sold. This is about how the slave market went. Slaves brought to the United States from Africa were sold at auction to the person who bid the highest amount of money for them. Groups of black men, women, and children were brought together for this purpose. Auctions were advertised with signs and newspaper ads. White people came beforehand to look over the slaves. They pried open their mouths to check their teeth. They pinched their arms and legs to test their muscles. Even worse was the way an auction could tear apart a family. A mother might be sold to a plantation owner in Mississippi, while her son or daughter might be sold to a plantation owner in Louisiana. The two would never see each other again. Husbands and wives, parents and children, brothers and sisters were cruelly separated. In 1859, a plantation owner named Pierce M. Butler sold 436 slaves to pay off money he owed. It was the largest slave auction on record in the United States, and it was called the Weeping Time. Why do you think they called it the Weeping Time? Josiah?
So many families were tore apart and had a lot of them crying.
Yeah, I can't even imagine this. It's hard to even think about it and read it. But 436 slaves were all sold off. And you can imagine, families were tore apart. Even if you weren't family, you think you were close friends with the people you'd grown up with, right? They were all sold.
My mom couldn't live with that. She says her number one fear is losing me and my sister.
You know, I think that's most parents' problem, right? They don't want that to happen. So that's why, for me, it's almost too hard to read this stuff. But this is what happened. Josiah?
It's not fair that you can get your life just sold.
Right.
You can't do anything about it.
Right. They could do nothing about it. That's the part that probably felt the worst. They couldn't do anything about it. The slaves, all of whom were born on Butler's plantations, were brought to a racetrack in Savannah, Georgia. They were put in stalls meant for horses while they waited for the auction to begin. By the end of the 2-day event, all of the slaves were sold away from the only home they'd ever known. They would never see their friends or family again. All right, back to Harriet. Minty's mother told her stories from the Bible. From her mother, Minty learned about Moses. Moses had lived thousands of years before. He led his people, the Hebrews, out of Egypt, where they had been slaves, and into freedom. Around 1826, when Minty turned 6, her life changed. Mr. Brodas hired her out. This meant that she had to leave her parents and her home when she was 6. So think about how little you were when you were 6. Not that long ago, right? But you were pretty little then. She had to go live and work for white people who could not afford to buy a slave of their own. The day she had to leave, a wagon came to take her away. Minty did not want to go. Her 2 older sisters had already been taken away. She remembered how they cried and cried, but they had to go anyway. So did Minty. Minty worked for a woman named Mrs. Cook. Mrs. Cook was a weaver. She spent her days in front of a big, noisy loom, so you'd weave fibers together to make clothing or blankets. Minty helped her wind the yarn. The air was filled with fuzz and lint. It made Minty cough. She dropped the yarn. She couldn't concentrate. Remember, she's 6 years old. Mrs. Cook got angry. When she was angry, she would punish Minty by whipping her. Slaves were whipped often. That was how the masters made them behave. Mrs. Cook told her husband that Minty was stupid and slow. So Mr. Cook had her help him instead. He was trying to catch muskrats. A muskrat is kind of like a beaver, but without the big, fat tail. It's got a skinny tail, kind of like a rat. He set out traps by the river. It was Minty's job to watch them. It was cold near the river, but it was quiet too. The air was clear and fresh. One day, Minty woke up feeling sick. Mrs. Cook thought she was pretending so she wouldn't have to work. Just as always, Mr. Cook sent Minty out to check the traps. She went down to the river, shivering from fever. When she got back, Mrs. Cook saw that she really was sick. She sent Minty home to her parents to get well. Old Rit took care of Minty for 6 weeks. But then, it was back to Mrs. Cook and the loom. Minty could not learn to do the job. The Cooks sent her home again. Next, Mr. Brodas hired Minty out to a woman named Miss Susan. Minty, who was only about 7, had to watch Miss Susan's baby. If the baby cried, Minty was whipped. At night, she sat by the baby's cradle. She rocked it gently. But Minty was tired. She would fall asleep and the baby would begin to cry. Then Miss Susan would get angry at being woken, and Minty was whipped again. Minty learned to stay alert for the baby, but it was hard. She was always tired. When was she supposed to sleep? That would have been hard, and she was 7. Once, when Miss Susan's back was turned, Minty reached for a lump of sugar that was in a bowl on the table. She'd never tasted sugar. Slaves were rarely given candy or treats. It looked so good. But Miss Susan saw her. Furious, she reached for the whip, but Minty was too fast. Out the door she flew. She did not stop running until she was sure Miss Susan was no longer chasing her. But now what? If she went back, she would face a whipping. Minty found a pig pen. She crawled into a hide. She crawled inside to hide. She was very young, but she was bold. She tried to fight the piglets for potato peelings and other scraps of food, but the mother pig pushed Minty away. After 5 days, Minty was filthy and starving. She knew she would have to return to her mistress. Later, Minty would say, "I didn't have anywhere else to go, even though I knew what was coming." All right. Instead of being hired out again, Minty was sent back to Mr. Brodas. Now Minty had to work in the fields, which was very hard. She split logs, loaded wood onto wagons, worked the plow, and drove oxen. Minty had grown strong and sturdy. She could do the jobs. And when she was in the fields, she could see the sky and feel the wind. The other slaves talked while they worked. That was how Minty began to hear new ideas. She heard slaves who said they wanted to be free. Some of them escaped from the plantation. They went north to freedom. Others, like Nat Turner, started rebellions to end slavery. Nat Turner was caught and killed, but his ideas didn't die. More and more, slaves thought about being free. Late one day in 1834, Mr. Brodas's slaves gathered with the slaves from another plantation to shuck the corn. They sang while they worked, peeling the pale green husks from the golden ears of corn. One slave stood apart. Minty watched him. He began moving across the big field. At first, the overseer, the man who kept the slaves in line, didn't notice. The slave was halfway across when the overseer saw him. He shouted for him to return, but the man kept going. The overseer followed, holding his big whip. Minty followed too. The overseer was running now, chasing the escaped slave. The slave ducked into a store. The overseer ran after him. The slave was cornered in the store. The overseer called to Minty. He wanted her to help him tie up the runaway slave. But Minty didn't move. She stood watching the two men. Suddenly, the slave pushed past the overseer and was out of the store, gone. As for Minty, she blocked the doorway so the overseer couldn't follow the slave. The overseer picked up a heavy 2-pound weight and threw it at the runaway. The weight missed the runaway slave, but it hit Minty on the forehead. She fell, unconscious and bleeding. She was brought to Old Rit, who nursed her tenderly. No one thought Minty would live. Still, Old Rit cared for her daughter night and day. Eventually, Minty recovered from the wound, though it left a scar on her forehead. It wasn't just the scar that made Minty different now. People treated her with respect. Although she was only 13 or 14, she had defied an overseer. What does defy mean? Angie?
Safe.
Well, defy, if you're defying an order, you go against it. You don't follow it. So remember the overseer told her to help stop the slave, and she just was like, no, I'm not going to do it. She blocked the door so he couldn't get to him. So that caused a lot of other slaves to respect her a lot. No longer was she called by her childhood name of Minty. Instead, she was called Harriet, her mother's name. Clearly, she was not a child anymore. So, what do you guys think about her childhood so far? Because she's just now becoming a teenager. Noah?
Pretty rough.
Rough. I can't even imagine this, right? It's hard to even fathom. But she made it through. Why do you think it inspired her to become the person we all know she became? Emma?
Because she helped like a bunch of people.
You think she wanted to keep other kids and other families from going through all of that? Yeah. If you've lived it, you know how terrible it was. Is that what you're going to say, Cadence? Yeah. All right, chapter 2, Looking for the North Star. Harriet was not the same after she got well. She suffered from headaches. Sometimes she had sleeping spells. One minute she might be awake and talking. The next, she'd be sound asleep. The spells frightened her. She heard a rumor. Mr. Brodas, her master, was going to sell her. He would sell some of her brothers, too. What would happen to her? She might be sent further south to New Orleans, Louisiana, or Natchez, Mississippi, in a chain gang. In a chain gang, the slaves were chained together at the ankles to prevent their escape. The trip south would be long and hard. If Harriet fell asleep in the road, the overseer would whip her. He might whip her very hard and leave her to die. Her brothers would not be able to save her. Even if she could survive the trip, Harriet knew that being sold someplace farther south was a bad thing. That was where so many of the cotton plantations were. Okay, this is a page about cotton and tobacco. Plantation owners in the South grew many different kinds of crops, which they could sell for money. Two of the most popular were cotton and tobacco. Cotton was used for cloth and clothing. The plantation owners needed many workers to plant and pick the cotton. First, the slaves had to pick the little balls of cotton from the cotton plants. Then they had to clean the cotton balls to make them ready for spinning. Slaves toiled long and hard to do this back-breaking job. Tobacco was another commonly grown crop. Slaves were also used to plant and pick tobacco. The owners of the big plantations knew that without slaves working for them, they would not be able to grow the crops that brought in their money. They told themselves that slavery was all right because they needed the workers. But the wealth enjoyed by the plantation owners was made from the blood and sweat of the slaves who worked for them. All right, back to her story. Working in the cotton fields was very hard work. Also, going farther south meant she would be further from the northern states, further from freedom. Harriet did not want to be a slave all her life. She wanted desperately to be free. Harriet began to pray that Mr. Brodas would die. To her amazement, he did get sick and died soon after. And Harriet found that she was sorry. She believed it was wrong to have prayed for his death. But now she had a new owner who was more fair. His name was Dr. Anthony Thompson. Dr. Thompson hired Harriet and her father Dr. Thompson hired Harriet and her father out to a builder named John Stewart. At first, she swept, dusted, washed clothes, and made the beds in Mr. Stewart's house. But she hated the work and asked if she could work outside with the men. Mr. Stewart agreed. Harriet worked alongside the men, cutting down trees and splitting logs. She was a good worker. Sometimes Mr. Stewart let her take other jobs. She even earned some money for her work. She had to give Mr. Stewart part of the money, but she could keep some of it. Harriet looked for more outdoor work, hauling logs, driving an oxen cart, plowing fields. Harriet worked 5 years for the builder. She became even stronger and more capable. She was more than 21 years old now, all grown up. Her father kept teaching her things too. He taught her to move through the woods without making a sound. He showed her how to find the North Star near the Big Dipper. The North Star was the guiding light for slaves. It showed the way north, the way to freedom. Ben told his daughter that with the North Star in sight, you would know you were headed in the right direction. But what if it were cloudy nights and the stars were hidden? Ben told his daughter to feel the trees for moss. Moss grew only on the north sides of trees. Even without the North Star, the moss could help a traveler. Harriet listened to what her father had to say. She remembered his words. In time, they would help her. Chapter 3, A Free Man's Wife. In 1844, when she was about 23, Harriet fell in love with John Tubman. John's parents had been slaves, but their master freed his slaves at the time of his death, so John was born free. John and Harriet made plans to marry. Harriet began making a quilt. She sewed it from different scraps of cloth. Sewing was hard work. She wasn't used to holding the needle. It was so small. Again and again she dropped it. It was hard to find a needle on the dirt floor. Still, she kept working until the quilt was done. The finished quilt had many colors, yellow, purple, white, and green. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. When she married John and went to live in his cabin, she took the quilt with her. John was happy with their life. He loved Harriet and liked the money she made. They had a cabin of their own. Life was good. But Harriet was not so content. What if her new owner wanted to sell her? She and John would be separated. She still thought about escaping. She begged John to go north with her. They would follow the North Star. In the north, Harriet would be a free woman. They would both be free. But John did not want to leave home. It was too dangerous. What would they eat? How would they live? He told Harriet to put escaping out of her mind. She could not. She told him about the dreams she had, dreams of freedom. All right, now here's a little part about abolitionists, which we know are people who wanted slavery to end. Abolitionists were 18th and 19th century reformers who believed slavery was evil and wanted to end or abolish it. Unlike other anti-slavery supporters, they worked toward a gradual end to slavery. Abolitionists called for slavery to end immediately. Although the Quakers had long opposed slavery, abolitionists were not just Quakers, but people of other religions as well. So it could be men, women, white people, black people, anybody could be an abolitionist. And all it meant was, I want slavery to end right now. The abolitionist movement started in 1870 in England when William Wilberforce and his followers spoke out against the African slave trade. The American abolitionist movement began in 1831 when William Lloyd Garrison started The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper in Boston. Other abolitionist newspapers and books followed. But it was not until after the Civil War ended in 1865 that the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery in the United States was passed. All right, back to Harriet. John, her husband, told Harriet that if she tried to escape, he would tell the master. All right, this is always shocking. What do you guys think about that? Cadence?
Are they married?
Yep, that's her husband.
I don't think that's right because they're married.
Yeah, and John was free, Harriet was not. But if she escaped, he said, I will tell the master on you. Emma?
They're married, right?
Uh-huh.
I would be like, no, I'm divorcing.
Mm-hmm. Zoe?
So he was free and she wasn't?
Mm-hmm.
And he said that he would tell the master she escaped.
Mm-hmm.
But why?
I know this is confusing to me too. It's almost maybe like they didn't have a marriage really built on love. I don't know how you could love your spouse and not want them to get freedom, right? So this is a complicated part to the story, but that's how he felt. He did not want her to escape. After that, Harriet began to fear her husband. John did not share her dream. If she wanted to be free, she would have to go north without John. One day, Harriet was working in a field close to a road. A white woman drove up in a buggy. She wore the plain clothes of a Quaker. She began to talk to Harriet. She asked Harriet her name and how she got the scar on her forehead. Harriet knew Quakers didn't believe in slavery. She could talk to the white woman. She could trust her. The woman came again on other days. If no one was watching them, they spoke. She told Harriet that if she ever needed help, she could ask her. In 1849, bad news came to the plantation. Harriet and some of her family were to be sold. Sold! Now she had to escape. She told her brothers, and they made a plan. Okay, here's a little bit about Quakers. Started in England in 1648, the Quakers were a Christian religious group founded by George Fox. They got their name because of Fox's demand that they tremble at the word of the Lord, like you're quaking. Quakers wore plain clothes and led simple lives. Their possessions were few. They were strongly opposed to war, so they did not like any violence or war. Their religion did not allow them to fight. They are still Quakers today, who worship in Quaker meeting houses without ministers or priests. Instead, each member of the group is allowed to speak at the meeting. So Quaker, it's a little bit like Amish families now. We've talked a little bit about Amish people. Just very simple way of living, very rooted only in religion. Quakers were such strong believers in equal rights for all people, they were very opposed to slavery. During the 19th century, many Quakers were also abolitionists. They helped slaves escape and offered their homes, stores, stables, and barns as stations on the Underground Railroad. They risked their own lives and safety and freedom to help other people who were not free. All right, so her and her brothers are making a plan. That night, she waited until John was asleep. Why do you think she waited till John was asleep? Eric? Yeah, he basically said, if you try to escape, I'm going to tattletale. That's what he basically said. Then she went to meet her brothers. They moved through the woods. How much noise her brothers made. They grew frightened. Escape was too risky. They were going back. Harriet had to come with them. She said no. She would go alone. But they would not let her. She tried to fight them. They were bigger and stronger, and they forced her to return. In 2 nights, a slave trader would be coming for Harriet and her brothers. Harriet faced a hard choice. If she stayed, she would be put on a chain gang. She would probably die on the long walk south. But if she escaped, who would go with her? Not her husband, John. Not her brothers. She decided to run away all by herself. She went to bed as usual. When John was asleep, she got up. Packing was easy. She put a little salt pork and cornbread in a bandana. She took the quilt she had made. She didn't dare take more. Harriet slipped out of the house. Finally, she was on her way to freedom. On her way north. Harriet was going to make her dream come true. And we will start back there tomorrow.